Chapter 21. Psilocybin, Magic Mushrooms. A few key facts. Psilocybin is the active compound in magic mushrooms. Yes, actual mushrooms. It's a psychedelic drug, broadly similar in popularity to other psychedelics. It's consumed by being eaten or drunk in a tea. Onset of psilocybin intoxication can occur within an hour and can last for several hours. Some effects include perceptual alterations, time distortion, vivid colours and shapes, mood alterations, and it can cause stomach pain. When people refer to magic mushrooms, for the most part they are talking about mushrooms that contain a psychedelic substance called psilocybin. It's not one particular species of fungus that contains the substance. In fact, estimates suggest about 180 different species of mushroom contain psilocybin. Despite one being synthetic and one being naturally occurring, the story of psilocybin and the story of LSD go at least partly hand in hand. Albert Hofmann, the chemist who discovered LSD, was also the first person to isolate psilocybin from a mushroom. Timothy Leary's Harvard research, and the subsequent psychedelic counterculture revolution that it in part inspired, utilised both LSD and mushrooms. And this perhaps isn't surprising, as psilocybin and LSD molecules are very similar, both bearing a strong resemblance to serotonin, a neurotransmitter found in our brains involved in regulating mood, appetite, and sleep, among other things. While LSD is more popular among older people, mushrooms are the most commonly used psychedelic among young people, those aged 34 and under, certainly in the USA. Mushrooms might be appealing because they are natural rather than synthetic, although as we've seen in other chapters, being natural doesn't necessarily mean being safer. It may also be because they grow naturally in many parts of the world, including around the UK, which means if people know what they're looking for, they can forage for mushrooms themselves or even grow their own, rather than buying them, although this is risky as there are also many poisonous mushrooms that look similar. And not too long ago, it wasn't illegal to buy or sell mushrooms in certain conditions in Britain. As a teenager, I used to get the train up to London on a Sunday to roam around Camden Town, trying on vintage coats and wearing too much eyeliner. I can vividly remember the shops selling mushrooms that lined the high street. Perhaps this combination of easy access and a perceived lower risk makes psilocybin appealing, particularly to young people, although the difference in prevalence between LSD and mushrooms is small. A 2016 prevalence survey in the USA called Monitoring the Future put past-year LSD use at around 3% in young adults, while non-LSD hallucinogen use was slightly higher, at around 3.5%. A 2015 survey also in the USA, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, found the proportion of adults of all ages who said they had ever tried LSD was slightly higher than for mushrooms, at around 9.5% compared to about 8.5%. A similar survey in the UK put past-year prevalence of LSD at less than 1% in young adults, while mushroom use was slightly higher at around 1%. What are the short-term effects? It's not unusual to consume mushrooms in a tea. You can eat dried or even fresh mushrooms by themselves, but they don't taste particularly nice, so people tend to try and hide them in other food to mask the taste, or drink them quickly. Intoxication intensity and duration will depend upon the dose of mushrooms that you consume, but intoxication usually begins at around 30 minutes after consumption, and a trip can last for 4 to 6 hours. The intoxication experience is broadly similar to that of LSD. People report experiencing perceptual distortion, often fractal-type imagery, a shifting of patterns when they're observed, or halos around objects. Researchers in the field inform me that true hallucinations are not common. People experience perceptual alterations or pseudo-hallucinations, but remain aware that what they are seeing or experiencing is not actually happening. Some experience synesthesia-like experiences, where senses that don't usually overlap start to do so. People can report sounds becoming colourful, or being able to smell words, for example. People can get extremely giggly while on mushrooms, but it can have other effects on emotion as well, and some people might get scared or anxious. There are many different species of mushroom that contain psilocybin, though most are small and brown or tan, and found in the genuses Psilocybe, Paneolus, and Copelandia, and the potency of different species can vary. A study conducted in 1982 tested 20 different species of mushroom that grow in the Pacific Northwest and found psilocybin present in 7 of them. Even within the same species, the amount of psilocybin varied by more than a factor of 7 between different collection events. The researchers found that levels of psilocybin and psilocin varied from between 0.1% to nearly 2% by dry weight of mushroom. Even when growing mushrooms themselves, they found that levels of psilocybin varied from one fruiting to the next. Because of the consumption of the plant matter of the mushroom, along with the psilocybin it contains, people can sometimes experience stomach cramps after eating them. Mushrooms can also give a person diarrhea or make them dizzy or nauseous. This doesn't occur as often or intensely when isolated or synthesized psilocybin is injected or consumed, more on that later, although dizziness and nausea can still sometimes occur. What are the longer-term effects? Longer term, there's little evidence that use of magic mushrooms can lead to addiction, similarly to other psychedelics. Some people report headaches after use, which might occur in the 24 hours after taking mushrooms. Much like other psychedelics, psilocybin can be particularly risky to consume for people with a predisposition to poor mental health, in particular people with a family history of psychosis or schizophrenia, as it's possible psychedelics can trigger latent psychotic symptoms or disorders. Myths and misconceptions. Mushrooms are responsible for human cognition taking a great leap forward. This is a really interesting one. It's also sometimes called the stoned ape hypothesis. It was conceived by Terence McKenna, an author and lecturer, sometimes referred to as the Timothy Leary of the 90s. He posited that magic mushrooms might be responsible for the leap in cognition and social organisation between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. Basically, that psilocybin led to enlightenment and human evolution. He believed that ingestion of a small amount of mushroom would improve vision and therefore hunting ability, and a larger amount would encourage copulation and therefore lead to more offspring, and that higher doses still would act to dissolve hierarchy, encourage group sex, and stimulate the language areas in the brain, encouraging the creation of art and music, and catalysing the beginning of language in humans. While at face value there's something quite appealing to this, mushrooms causing consciousness expansion, his arguments don't really stand up to scrutiny on closer inspection. It is perfectly possible that psilocybin-containing mushrooms could have been present in areas where Homo erectus lived, but McKenna's theory doesn't really reference the swathes of evidence from paleoanthropology that has investigated this period in human evolution. Some of his hypotheses, for example around the impact of small doses of psilocybin on vision, don't seem to be supported by research that's looked at the impact of the substance on human visual ability. Similarly, there's little evidence that use of mushrooms increases sex drive and would lead to more offspring. Also, in early cultures where the use of psychedelics has been recorded, for example among Amazonian tribes, the societal dynamics he predicts in his theory are not seen. McKenna believed lots of interesting things about psilocybin. Another particularly wild theory he espoused was that mushrooms are actually an advanced species of high intelligence from another planet, whose spores had drifted to Earth from elsewhere and were trying to communicate with humans via the psychedelic experience. He also speculated that a psychedelic trip could be a form of trans-dimensional travel or a doorway into the Gaian mind, a way to speak directly to the planet. All of these theories are of course very hard to prove or disprove, so it's unclear. Mushrooms are just natural LSD. While psilocybin and LSD are chemically very similar, they're not identical, and certainly the intoxication experience is reportedly slightly different between the two substances. Although as discussed in the LSD chapter, how much of this is due to expectation effect is hard to tease out. A related myth, that LSD is extracted from magic mushrooms, is similarly false. Although LSD was in fact derived from ergot, which is a fungus. In this regard, LSD is semi-synthetic, since it was synthesized from a naturally occurring compound. As I've described earlier, LSD was derived by Albert Hofmann before psilocybin had been isolated from mushrooms, which was also done by Dr. Hofmann more than a decade after he discovered LSD. There are also known pharmacological differences in the action of LSD and psilocybin that might further explain some of the differences in subjective effects of the two. For example, while both substances have an effect on serotonin receptor action, there is evidence that LSD has an impact on certain dopamine receptors known as D2 receptors that psilocybin does not have. So this is a myth. All psychedelic mushrooms bruise blue. Do mushrooms bruise? Well, yes, if you squeeze the stem or the cap, this can cause some discoloration, a bruise. Some people claim this is a good way to identify whether a mushroom is psychedelic or not, but actually it's not accurate enough to do so reliably, not without other information as well. Some mushrooms containing psilocybin will not bruise blue, and some mushrooms that don't contain it will. Mycologists might use bruising colour in the final stages of identification of a certain species of mushroom, as it can help to differentiate between two otherwise very similar-looking species. But if you don't have this other knowledge, bruising colour will probably not help you, and could put you at risk of ingesting a toxic mushroom. It's a myth. Does psilocybin have any medical uses? In recent years, there's been a growing body of research conducted into the potential therapeutic effects of psilocybin. So far, these studies have been on a very small scale, often with less than 20 individuals sampled. Researchers in the UK gave 15 healthy individuals who were experienced with using psychedelics, either psilocybin or placebo, intravenously on 2 separate occasions. While they were intoxicated, they were put in an MRI scanner, which is essentially a giant electromagnet that uses pulses of radio waves to align the spin of protons in the water molecules in whatever bit of the body is in the scanner, in this case, the head. Transmitters within the scanner can then pick up information about this spin alignment. Differences in the spin can indicate what type of tissue or cell is present in certain areas of the brain. As well as that, it can give information about function or activity in the brain, inferred by the oxygenation levels of blood in different brain areas, which affects the spin alignment. Researchers used the scanner to measure blood flow during placebo and during psilocybin intoxication, and compared the findings. They were surprised to see that blood flow was decreased while the participants were on psilocybin. This decrease was particularly striking in known hub areas of the brain, areas that showed especially high levels of blood flow in the placebo condition. To investigate their findings further, these researchers, along with colleagues in Italy, used the functional imaging scans to derive brain connectivity data. The picture they generated from the data was quite striking. Whilst on placebo, connections in the brain were mostly streamlined and within functional areas. Vision areas of the brain were connected to other vision areas, and so on. The picture of the psilocybin-intoxicated brain, by contrast, showed connections across the gamut of brain regions. The image they present in their paper looks like a child's spirograph gone wrong. Disparate points are joined up where previously they were unconnected. There were no extra connections, the total number was the same, but the way these connections crossed between brain regions was completely different. The researchers found these connections were not random and seemed to be stable while the individual was intoxicated, returning to the more expected pattern afterwards. What might these findings mean? The authors interpret them as evidence of a dampening of the usual brain connections during psilocybin, allowing less used connections to occur. They also highlight the relevance of their findings to the potential for psilocybin to be used as a treatment for depression, pointing out that certain brain areas that are overactive in people with depression, such as the prefrontal cortex, were the same areas showing lower blood flow during psilocybin intoxication. Does psilocybin have any therapeutic effect? So far, the evidence is mainly based on small studies, mostly without placebo controls and with very small sample sizes. But research is being conducted to investigate the impact of psilocybin on a number of conditions that people anecdotally report being improved by mushrooms. These include cluster headaches and depression. As well as that, trials are underway in the USA and in the UK investigating the potential for the use of psilocybin as a treatment for addiction to various substances, particularly alcohol and tobacco, and even as a treatment for helping patients with a terminal illness come to terms with their diagnosis and its implications. What does treatment with psilocybin look like? Firstly, it's important to stress that a person isn't merely given the drug and then sent on their way. The substance is administered as part of an intensive therapy by trained psychologists or psychotherapists, with thorough preparation before psilocybin is administered, and dedicated integration sessions to process the experience afterwards. There are a couple of different ways that this can happen. In some cases, talking therapy occurs while a person is intoxicated, usually under the influence of a low dose of psilocybin. In others, the psilocybin experience plays out without discussion, and then the participant will be invited to talk about it afterwards. Dr. Albert Garcia Romeo, one of the researchers who ran some of these studies at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, described it as like watching a film. You wouldn't talk all the way through a movie, you wait until it's finished. He told me about the setup for running these studies. A lot of thought goes into the room in which a person will have their psilocybin session. Set and setting, as we've discussed throughout this book, is extremely important in influencing the type of intoxication experience. Participants lie on a bed or a sofa in a softly lit room. They will wear an eye mask and headphones with a carefully curated soundtrack. Someone will be with them throughout their intoxication experience, on hand in case they experience any distress. And they will already know and trust this person. In fact, the participant will typically have had a month of therapy before any drug is administered to them. This will be something like cognitive behavioural therapy or motivational enhancement therapy, and will be tailored to whatever the trial is investigating. For example, the therapy might focus on smoking behaviour, barriers to quitting, and motivations to quit, as well as a life review to understand where the participant is in their life and how smoking has played a role in their life. Sometimes a trial protocol will administer psilocybin only once, sometimes up to 3 times, with aftercare between each psilocybin session. So far, these trials are finding tantalising hints that psilocybin could have some therapeutic potential in certain circumstances for some people for a variety of conditions. Having said that, we are a long way off our doctors prescribing us mushrooms. These studies are done in small numbers of individuals who opt in to take part, although participant numbers are increasing in more recent studies. It's also notoriously difficult to blind studies using psychedelics. Even if a participant doesn't know they've been given psilocybin, as soon as the substance takes effect, it will in all likelihood become apparent to both participant and experimenter. Recent study designs are trying to get around this by giving what are known as active placebos, substances that have an effect in some ways similar to that of the substance being researched. In the case of psilocybin, some studies have used psychoactive substances such as niacin, ephedrine, methylphenidate, or even lower doses of a psychedelic. Even so, research has found that trained session moderators are able to ascertain correctly the condition of a participant in such studies somewhere between 77 to 95% of the time. What don't we know? There are other types of hallucinogenic mushroom, which contain different substances to psilocybin. Probably the most well-known is fly agaric. If you picture a toadstool, you're probably picturing fly agaric, a white stem and a red cap with white spots. There's far less research around fly agaric than there is around psilocybin, but the active chemicals thought to give the psychedelic effect are muscimol and ibotenic acid. Anecdotal reports suggest that the intoxication effect of fly agaric is broadly similar to psilocybin-containing mushrooms, but slightly less pleasant and potentially with more unwanted side effects, including sweating and stomach cramps. It's also possible to experience severe health problems after eating fly agaric. Some estimates suggest consuming around 15 caps could be a lethal dose of the mushroom.